Thanks, Julian. That was a fascinating talk, Tom, and I think it's given us, well, this panel, a lot to chew on. So thank you. So this panel, perhaps we could start with, I will introduce our panelists. Great honour to have Chris Naylor here, who is the Chief Executive of London Borough of Barking and Dagenham, and Alison Pritchard, the Deputy National Statistician and Director General for Data Capability Office for National Statistics. So I think we've been given, well, a lot of meaty topics to cover on the back of Tom's talk. I think it's interesting that we're at the decade mark of the founding of GDS, Government Digital Service. We've seen an enormous amount of progress over that decade. We've seen an enormous amount of technological change at the same time. And I think particularly in the last 18 months, 2 years, with the impact of COVID, we've seen an acceleration of a lot of these trends. So I think it's a very interesting time to be discussing these issues. And I personally I feel like we are on the cusp of potentially a big breakthrough. I think that combination of key individuals now being in place, like Tom, key organizational structures coming together, a government with the will to do something about this, a sense that the public now have understood, particularly as a result of COVID. I think the experience of having to interact with the government remotely has changed a lot of people's attitudes to digital services and the potential for digital government. And I think as I was very keen to explore in my earlier talk, I think it's also opened up everyone's eyes to the impact or the potential of data and how better data sharing across government. And I think, Chris, I'd be very, very curious to hear your reflections on better data sharing between central and local government, and how we can collectively start to address that to tackle some of these big issues. So anyway, I think that's enough from me. Would love to kick off perhaps with Alison, if you would like to some opening reflections, and then we can hand on to Chris and then begin the Q&A.
That'd be great. Thanks, Lewis. And it really is good to be back with Tech UK. So I'm grateful for the opportunity to talk amongst colleagues and friends. And I should say right up front, I feel for Tom, because I know what it's like to stand in for a minister and have to do a speech at last minute. I think the last time I did that was an evening event, and at least I managed to buy a new dress and charge it too expensive, so there are some benefits. And hearing about Polly, I know her, and I'm hoping she's going to be on the happy path of boring magic if all goes well. So look, I've previously led GDS for a period of time, and so I've been operating in the spaces where I've seen these changes happen. And I think one thing to realise right up front is you don't get a binary leap in terms of all of a sudden all these things are fixed and they're all better, but you do see the change and the progress that is being made. And that is always set against expectations that run alongside it. So we're always going to be a little bit of playing catch up with, I think, where we would like to be. But I think there's just one thing: we should celebrate progress as we progress there. And if I now look from the Office for National Statistics perspective, it feels the shift and the journey that we're on is reflecting this overarching change. So we already have a responsibility for statistics of the production of statistics, analysis, actionable insight on the economy and the society through the use of data. But now we also have a role in integrating and serving up data for others to use in a safe and secure and trusted environment. And that is at the big data end of the journey. And I might say that about Tom's comments around the government data exchange and how some things we're doing complement that from a kind of a big data environment. So the work we've been doing is at the heart of the National Data Strategy Mission 3, so the transforming of government's use of data. And in fact, one of the things we're doing in the integrated data service is cited in the National Data Strategy as the means of allowing government to make better use of its own data. Although when we say the government's own data, we really mean the public's data that government is holding in various different ways. And that's quite an important perspective on how we handle that. We're seeing a lot of transformation continue, and the transformation in the use of data is quite focused on the ability to work at regional and what we describe as sub-national levels. And I think this will be of interest to Chris and the work we're doing in enabling us to look below the level of just how the nation is doing, but how it's doing regionally. And through the use of integrating data assets to look at that as well. No better example than levelling up, where the insight needs to go so much further than, well, actually turns out the South's doing a bit better than the North. We have to be able to provide actionable insight around the drivers of wealth across those regions, the type of industries, the demographics, the location of services. And you do this through the combining of further data assets and what we describe in some cases novel data. And we're doing some interesting things regionally and locally, combining data about properties that we have through VOA, along with imagery, for instance, showing the state and status of the high street, both graffiti, for instance, where buildings are boarded up. We're using NPL analysis of BBC News around what's impacting on different regions, and job applications, and all sorts of things that give you a much bigger picture of what's occurring. And net zero is another example where that subnational view leads us to need a national net zero data asset that we can then incorporate and use effectively. And just to make a couple other observations in terms of how we're further transforming our use and acquisition of data, then the world of surveys, for instance, which we have undertaken for many decades, is being enhanced through the use of government-held data or public data, which we call admin data, and that comes from the likes of HMRC and DCMS and local authorities as well, allowing us really to build a quicker and more accurate picture of the health of society and the economy. No better example than population estimates. So the census that's been undertaken in 21, we need to be able to do this effectively through the use of data on an ongoing basis. The goal has to be population estimates at regional level, at ward level, if you like, within local authority thinking, in a near real-time status. And that's got to be the goal for the next few years to get us to that position, so that our population estimates are not only 10-year activities. We've just released information on suicide rates. I think the whole of COVID has demonstrated the value of combining data for public health. For the first time, we've been able to highlight suicide prevalence amongst students, for instance, which has allowed universities to take action. And we did that by linking death registrations with higher education registrations. And these things sound easy, but you have to find ways of combining and integrating data, which takes an awful lot of data science sometimes to make that happen, because we don't have a national spine, as we probably know. In the data science world, lots of interesting developments for synthetic data. We're having partnerships with Turing Institute, and something I'm quite excited about called nowcasting. Not in the world of forecasting in ONS, but what we can do is use indicators from recent data to be able to create better analysis of what we think is happening now. So you remove that lag from the picture. So I think my overarching comment is real progress. The blockers we might come onto are still there. We're overcoming them. And there's ever more, I think, that we can do to try and remove the friction from data sharing. Thanks.
Thank you, Alison. That was fascinating. And yeah, give us even more to chew on, I think. Chris, over to you.
Thank you very much. Well, it's great to be here. Well, sort of, in the way we've got used to being present in things. And I was thrilled to get the invitation. So thank you very much. And I think part of the reason why I was keen to come and talk actually was because I think I agree with this hypothesis that we're on the cusp of something. But it's important, I think, for us to kind of reflect what that is and how we get it over the line. So I guess it's a big topic, and I've sort of written down here sort of three things that I thought I'd sort of observations I'd share really, which kind of move from sort of the more obvious to the less obvious, but they're no less important. So I'll canter through those. The context for me saying these things is, I think, as you mentioned, I've been the chief executive here in Barking and Dagenham now for the last 7 years. So if nothing else, things have definitely started to be my fault. But last year I spent 10 months as on a secondment to be the interim chief executive of Birmingham City Council, and was supporting them at the start of the pandemic, and while they sorted out some issues in relation to the Commonwealth Games. So I'm kind of drawing on both the Commonwealth Games. So I'm drawing on both of those experience really. So I think the first thing to say, and this is kind of definitely in the obvious box, is the pandemic has absolutely revealed the sort of the power, potential and risks, I think, in relation to data, tech, actionable insight, and also I think the conditions within which that we need in place to enable us to systematically use that data and insight on a day-to-day basis. So look, in B&D we used, although it was a bit kind of brown paper and sticky back plastic, sort of predictive analytics, pulling data sets across different public service organisations locally to kind of build a model of who was at risk and who essentially needed the kind of shielding support. And we were able to do that 2 or 3 weeks ahead of the sort of information coming from government with a remarkable amount of accuracy, which enabled us to get to people far earlier on in the pandemic, essentially because we were able to pull the sorts of things that Alison was pull together and then sort of make some, observations on that data. In Birmingham, it was, just thinking back on it, just remarkable that the sort of daily rhythm started at sort of 8:30 in the morning with a set of senior people looking at some epidemiology data for 1.2 million people. Sometimes we were looking at it at that level, other times we were right down at household level, particularly at the early stages of the sort of second spike, really trying to understand the patterns and what was happening, and that we were then sort of making decisions on the basis of that data at 10 o'clock and sort of implementing it by noon. And I think for me there's a thing about that how do we kind of establish that battle rhythm for a whole host of issues and problems that we face, not just this particular one, because it absolutely was, I think, for the first time in my career where there was that absolute connection between data and information and management. And I guess sort of then finally we've all experienced, haven't we, sort of the ability to work differently. Certainly in my case, I ran Europe's largest city council from my front room in North London. Right, I visited it 6 times because there was literally no point in going there because everyone else was at home as well, and yet I was able to form sort of bonds of trust and a sense of purpose and connections with people that you'd never imagine was possible, essentially down a telly, right? And I say all of that because the same platforms that we used and have used to do our jobs have also been used in the last year to kind of it cuts both ways, I suppose, kind of amplify mistrust. People have died because they chose to trust information on those platforms rather than trust me, and that's a problem we need to talk about. So I think that's the first thing. Second thing, then, I think COVID has absolutely, I think, revealed hidden in plain sight sort of features of our economy and society that we've all sort of known about, but was kind of like revealed like a smack in the nose. Again, Birmingham, if you're a Bangladeshi man, twice as likely to die of COVID than if you're a white man. And I suppose what that has revealed, certainly for local authorities, is an absolute need to understand those kind of structural inequalities, understand the root causes of them, and then double down on efforts to do something about it. And we can understand that in a kind of qualitative way. We can go and talk to people about it, but we also, I think, can understand it in a quantitative way. And I think this is kind of, Alison, to your point about sort of how we can now bring together information, understand those root causes as a series and sequence of data attributes that we can then essentially attach to households and individuals. I mean, this is all kind of, there's an ethical piece here, which I'm sure we'll get onto, right? But it enables us to build a predictive model who is at risk of crisis, and then we get to those people before they tip into crisis. Now, the point the reason why I'm sort of mentioning this is because that information was incredibly helpful when we were on a war footing, when we were literally in a command and control management arrangement. But I think the experience of Barking and Dagenham over the last 7 years, where we've genuinely tried to change what we do in relation to the data and insight in front of us, is it requires us to fundamentally change and reform what we do as an organisation. Otherwise, what happens is the data and insight just bounces off the side of it, which then brings me, I think, to my final point, which is, I think, at the heart of all of this is the need to kind of profoundly reimagine the nature of the public services that we provide. I was struck by Tom's point about data silos. Well, a lot of those silos were created by our great-grandparents and in some cases our great-great-grandparents, depending on how old you are, to essentially manage and respond to the challenges of their time. And that time has just changed. And a lot of our services, I guess, are in a kind of react and respond design. There is a problem, we assess that problem, we test whether or not people meet the criteria by asking them to fill out various forms, and then we provide a service. I think if we look at the problem with that, essentially, is that demand is overwhelming those services, as we know, and that they are not designed from first principles to address root cause. They're designed to address the consequences of things going wrong. Now, I think where we're heading is a set of public services that need to be about prediction and persuasion. And what I mean by that is understanding those people who are carrying risks in their lives, who are struggling, who it only takes is one or two things to tip them, and then they become very, very expensive clients of ours. But when and data and tech can play a huge part in that. We can literally, I think, in Barking and Dagenham, know who those households are now who have 7, 8, 9, 10 times more risk than other people. The tech takes us to those people, but once we've found those people, it places a huge burden and stress on the relationship and intimacy we have with them. It's a completely different kind of paradigm for people feeling I've got a problem, I'm going to go to the council or to DWP or whoever, to the state going to them and saying, are you okay? It's a fundamentally different kind of thing, and it places a massive burden, I think, on this point about trust. So I'm going to finish with just saying a little bit about that just for a second, because I think for me the point about connecting data sets across government, like we should be in the no-brainer territory in relation to that. Understand the pathways, understand the pinch points, sort of JFDI, right? The reason why that is because I think for every single public service and public service in the country, every interaction with a member of the public is an opportunity to either win trust or destroy trust. And so when we ask people for information that we already have, particularly when we've sent them that information in the first place, which happens regularly in councils, you want to get a parking permit, you have to send the council tax bill that we sent them in the first place back to the council to prove that they are a resident, all that kind of madness. Like their opportunity, that we destroy trust. And the problem with that is that almost everything that matters in the future relies upon us having a relationship of trust. Behaviour change in relation to climate change, behaviour change in relation to obesity, behaviour change in relation to whether or not you're going to have a vaccine or not. These are life and death things, and they all are founded on trust. Final thing then is I think we can spend a lot of time beating ourselves up as public civil servants in relation to this. I do think there is an issue with legacy systems and the way in which the kind of the business model for those providers who provide into the public sector and how they are incentivized to ensure that their systems are capable of joining up and connecting with others in ways that aren't seen as cash cows for them, right? We've all experienced it. Oh, you want an API for that? Well, that'll be that's going to cost you the same as a house. Like, what? For switching something? Don't be daft. You know, the world's most expensive spreadsheets don't really work. You know, I think at some point someone's going to disrupt that, and it'll be interesting to watch. But in the meantime, I think that's where we need to pay attention to as much as anything else. Right, I'll stop. Thanks.
Thank you, Chris. That was really fascinating and has prompted lots of thoughts on my side. I mean, I would love to maybe just get down to brass tacks for a minute, and you know what it sounds like everyone's very aligned on the vision. The lessons have been learned from COVID from the last 10 years. So how do we get there? And I come at this from an engineering, we're a technology company, a software provider. We tend to think in terms of the data silos that you mentioned, Chris, that Tom mentioned. You know, we see those as a technical problem. How do you bring this data together, overcome those? But one thing that I've observed many times and questioned myself about when we're working with large, complex organizations, private sector and public sector, is the technical silos that you see everywhere. Are they a function of the way in which, as you said, Chris, IT has been procured over the years and everyone ends up with a kind of Heath Robinson-esque landscape? Or are they actually reflections
to then deliver services and provide the insight? Because the operating models remain within a particular piece of infrastructure. And the trouble we have is making one service or department reliant on something happening elsewhere, and that's when you start to generate operating models that cross those boundaries. I really don't think it's a technical problem. At least there are technical elements. You've indicated already from your experience, Louis, the sort of the nature of the technical silos. Chris, you've highlighted the cost sometimes of being able to break those through, but in reality that's fixable. The bigger challenge, I think, relies on a bit of the history of how we got here. So the essence, there's often a debate that I'd like us to get into. I think we need a better public discourse on that use of data and trust, because we get stuck at the question of, is this data being used beyond its original purposes of being collected? And if you take an incredibly narrow view of that particular question, then the answer is often no, and therefore it cannot be used in any other way. But if you take the view that allows use cases that are of value to the public to surface, then you say, of course, we should be using the data in that fashion. And an example of that will be when I was leading GPS, the Vulnerable People Service, which generated food parcels for those that were medically vulnerable, and also priority places in supermarket, sort of online shopping. Now, the data that we use started from GP-related medical data. And I'm sure that data was never generated with the intention it would be food parcels. But the fact that we're able to do that by using data in a constructive, positive way demonstrates that the ability for us to talk about the benefits to society in using this data across boundaries, rather than looking through the
in B&D over the last 7 years is be quite mission orientated because of, I mean, I haven't got time to get into all this, but our context was pretty dire, and it was like sort of move or die. No one's coming to the rescue. We've got to try and sort this out. And in particular, in relation to this point about prevention, right? Off the sides of a set of services that have regulators, which are very clearly kind of organized. And what we had to do essentially was to take, well, we created a new service, a new department, and we created a new silo, right? And we brought 16 services into one across housing, homelessness, children's services, adult social care, domestic abuse, a whole set of things. And rather than what had historically been the case, which is a person with need comes into the council and says, I think I've got a problem, and we would then go, well, let's look at this presenting need and see whether or not you meet the threshold for us to do something about it. The first question we now ask is what's causing this? Like, what is causing you to be homeless? Like, we could absolutely do the homelessness test and possibly find you somewhere to live, a bit crap along the way. It's going to cost us a lot of money. We can try and understand what's happening in your life. And when you do that and you kind of get people kind of excited about that, and you have ways and all the rest of it, there are sort of 4 or 5 key reasons why they become homeless, right? Their landlord is overcharging them. Okay, well, we'll do something. We can help with that. We've got a landlord's licensing program. Debt. Goodness me, debt's issue. And often the first organisation in the country that gets to find out if someone's struggling with their money is the council, because everyone knows the. And so how we start to, again, just demystify some of this stuff, make it obvious for people, and then I think the data piece comes alive. So I then think there's a kind of understanding like what insight we need and when we need it. And this is an oversimplification, but in essence, what is the stuff that we need periodically to make sure that we're kind of strategically pointing in the right direction, making the right interventions, investing in the right places, forming the right partnership, right? And that's a kind of refresh. And frankly, I sort of don't care what the boring magic looks behind the scenes on that. And if that is a set of people pulling stuff together into an Excel, various different sources, and getting me some insight, brilliant. Right? I don't need that to join up every single day for stupid reporting. And we've got to be super rigorously focused on what is the stuff that needs to join up. Slightly, 20 years ago, something needs to join up. It doesn't. People don't ring the council and get on the phone. How do we come and adopt that? That's not a sequence that happens. But there are sequences that absolutely do happen all the time, and those data sets in real time need to connect with people whose then job it is to see the bigger picture of that person's life.
That's fascinating. Thank you, Chris, Alison, and it. There was what Tom, I guess, described to map those pathways through government. Both you touched on this, both of you, which I think is also a question that's come in from the audience around the changes in legislation that might be required to enable data sharing more broadly. And you touched on that with this question of purposes and so forth. I think the government went into command and was very strong. A lot of the organizational hopefully, touch wood, return to some semblance of normality. If we can bottle the command and control, the mission, are there still those legal gateways that are absent? What needs to happen on that front?
I mean, I think there is hand as a nation to go down that route. There's always intent for data to be shared, always, you know, at every level. You ask a question, the answer is yes, of course, that makes sense. The challenge in the process usually comes down to interpretation of specifics, such as you know, uses of data within the interpretation, but also the identified data, and that's where we get into really complex discussions around what we are using. There was a lot of talk about sharing individual data assets from one place to another in a very binary sense. What we needed was this piece of data to move over there. But the world is moving towards a far more integrated view of being able to combine data to provide a better insight. Now that requires you to be able to link data, but you can only link data if you have a level record, take that kind of analysis. And I think the current legislation was kind of shaped around the world, as we know, about 5 years ago, where actually the use of data was a little bit more limited in the way that technically you do it. And so we need to sort of refresh our thinking of what it means to be able to use data in one place that started as a combination of data from two other places, and then combined with a third data set, possibly from the commercial sector or other data sources. Have, in my view, is that data. And I suppose we've moved in the last few years from a heavily focused model on protecting data towards an appetite on more exploitation, in a positive way, of data. The thing that I think we already touched upon earlier in this, we have to retain public trust in the journey on this, because public trust changes the nature of what we do with legislation, and it changes the culture to use that data. So I don't think this can be a kind of a mutually exclusive, let's just create the Wild West of data being used. So much of what we do as organisation is dependent on maintaining that trust of the public. And that's where I think any adjustment to legislation or any further reinterpretation of existing legislation needs that more refined engagement with the communication, but a form of engagement that allows us to retain that trust as we progress. They go hand in hand, I think.
Yeah, no, I did. And also, so the trick to being a local authority chief executive is you need to know 3 things about 1,000 things, but you generally work with people who know 1,000 things about 3 things, right? So I definitely feel like I'm in that space. So like this feels like item number 5 on the list of things I should know about data, and I don't. Anyway, so but I do think this point about. So I think often my job is to kind of just bring clarity to like what is the thing we're actually asking for, as opposed to the thing that people might be imagining we're asking for, which is too hard, and then they've got stuck. So it's kind of unstick the thing by going, okay, if that's too hard, what about this? Because that'll be good enough. And they go, oh yeah, we can do that. All right, great, crack on then, sort of thing. And I do think quite often the sort of, and going down the anonymity route. And I think if you think about my 2 buckets, there's a sort of the strategic insight and the kind of day-to-day stuff. Actually, for that strategic insight, anonymous data sets that are kind of super output level or something can be fine, and that's much more straightforward, I think. So therefore, I think quite a lot of my job is to kind of, leadership where there is risk, create environment within which those risks can be understood and the interpretations made, and make it safe for people to make decisions and know we've got their back if we've made that decision. So how do we kind of create the the psychological safety for people to kind of play in this space where they don't think they're going to get fired for doing something wrong? I think this point about trust is really layered, and we could have an entire conference on it. I think there is a thing about the extent to which people feel in control about what does government know about them. I think that's well rehearsed, and again, people on this call will know better than me about that. But I don't think it's crucial like what we do with that information. And let me just create a sort of obvious sort of straw man. Like, I don't think there are many people who, if their GP rang them up and said, Chris, we've been looking at information about you, men of your age, and these attributes about you, and we've just looked at your last blood test, and I'm slightly worried that totally fine, right? Because I've got a relationship. He's got my best interests at heart. That's the fundamental thing, that he is motivated to do things that are good for me. Now, let's imagine a scenario in Barking and Dagenham where we have understood a series of risk factors about a particular family, which takes us to a view that says they're on the cusp of a problem, and I want to speak to them before that problem happens. Because if that problem does happen, a child may be brought into care, there's financial cost, emotional cost, everything. It's a very different conversation. Who knocks on the door and goes, hello, I'm from the council, we think you might be 6 away from an incident of intimate. And I think for me comes back to this point about, like, this is a conversation about data and science, but it's really a conversation about intimacy and trust and relationships between the state, civil society, and all the rest of it. It's a bigger question.
Can I build on that, Louis? Because I think the concepts of trusted research, more of us will be hearing about as time progresses. Back to the point that this isn't a technical thing. This is the governance that we place around the use of data provides the ability for us to do it in an ethical form and do it with the confidence of the public. So trusted research environments, there are a half a dozen across the nation in various different forms. I think we'll see more of those, and they're based around the 5 safes principle, which allow you then to work ethically. And that's where I think, Chris, the distinction between the preventative on what feels like a very fruitful, constructive form, with on the example you give of the domestic violence, to have the dialogue that allows us to shape where we draw the line, and the public will draw the line in different places, and that's fine. I have to say I'm always a bit reluctant to click on websites I visit all the time. Now, I would hope that people are clicking the cookies for ONS because we use that data very sensibly, as do Barking Dagenham, I'm sure. But it's that layering, I think, as Chris indicated. It feels like it's the 2022 discussion for the country, because the initiatives that Tom was setting out provide us the means of being able to do this stuff better. So the government data exchange is about the metadata operational level. We'll be thinking about single login and identity data, all that kind of stuff in due course. So I would say let's get on that journey of having that debate more effectively. But I think there are things that we can do in the meantime. The reason we're interested in this, maybe level 6, in synthetic data, is because it enables us to start handling some of these big questions without it. That becomes quite important. So I think we're on this case, but I think we also have to recognise that there are some difficult questions we have to be able to address as a nation. Some countries do it well. We often hear about Denmark and others, and that control that the public have over the thing we should study and understand, because it's that kind of space where I think we will continue to build our ability to use data more effectively.
If you don't mind, I'd love to kind of just stay on the theme of trust. A couple of questions have come in around this, and I think Chris, you made powerful comments in your opening about disinformation and use of platforms has been. My sense, just building on what you both said, is there's has to be taken with it. But at the moment, there's a lot of misinformation, a lot of misunderstanding. The GP data, Dave, over the summer is perhaps an example that you would have reflections on. My sense is, though, that trust is built through accountability. But be seen to be accountable and build that trust that way. Similarly, trust is built, as you said, Chris, through competence. Competence generates legitimacy and trust. But how can the government not just be competent, but be seen to be competent? And specifically around the management of data, the use of data, it feels to me like there's as much a communications dimension to there is a substantive. Curious to hear your thoughts on that and how to begin that debate.
So we start this time. Well, I don't think there's a glib and straightforward answer to it, other than I think for me, and it's been so important in Barking and Dagenham that we talk about it all the time, and we sort of see it as a kind of acid test. Like, are we building trust or destroying it? And do people, ultimately feel, whatever they may think about a specific thing, that the council's got their best interests at heart? And the reason why it's important to us, and we had a kind of real wake up call moment, was and this is going to sound like a party political point, it's not, it's just an observation. In 2006, 12 members of the British National Party were elected to council. No less remarkable because they only stood 13 candidates. And those people who've looked at the data say, had they stood in all 51 seats, they may well have won control of the council. Now, there's various views as to what was going on there, but I think the most compelling one is that was a catastrophic loss of trust in the institutions of government to address the understand, hear, communicate back, and resolve the issues that a set of people were feeling. Now, we may all have views whether or not voting for a foundation to that, but that's what happened. And I think the conclusion, and it started as a political conversation, so this was politicians going, this is not okay, and it's cascaded into and affects everything that we do as an organisation, like what our mission is, how we operate, how we performance manage people, and how we think about data and insight. And there's absolutely a kind of democratic, civic accountability, conversations, both online and offline aspect to that. There's a how we design what we do, the sort of values and skill sets of the council. But it also means that we do kind of push through when the going gets tough on why the flipping council tax system doesn't talk to the parking system, when the council tax system is the one that gives us the most reassuring identity data. And we've got the madness of people having to scan, who scans things, scan their council tax bill into a computer that we then sits on a flipping server next to the one that's got the data on it, all of that madness. So it's a sort of momentum to kind of push through and resolve it. And so I think the answer to the question is, first of all, we have to see trust as an asset in its own right, and that everything we do is about building that asset, and there's going to be layers to it, and it's going to take a generation.
So Chris highlights some significant issues there. I believe public bodies are accountable. I generally believe we have the structures and the legal framework, the public bodies are accountable. I think the bigger point is being the seen to be accountable point you make, Louis. And a colleague of mine uses the phrase democratizing access to data, which I think is really quite a powerful concept around. We often talk about the ability for public bodies to use data for best effect. And usually almost invariably for good reason, good public good. But there is something around allowing the public to be part and parcel of that understanding and therefore decision making, which perhaps part and parcel behind the situation. So we can take, I think, and the ONS is independent from government. We're a non-ministerial organisation, and part of our role is to provide statistics and analysis and insight without putting the political slant on it or the judgment or other factors. And I think the more that we can carve out these differences between, we need bodies to be able to provide actionable insight. We need the public to have better access to actionable insight. And look, we're doing a lot of work as part of our programme to increase the ability for the public and the media to have access to this kind of information more readily. And then we need the different layers, ultimately to allow public bodies to make judgments and decisions that of course have to be accountable in their own right as well. So part and parcel, I think, of the dangers of talking about data, and we've done it for years, is we treat it as something, as quite a distinct project. And Chris, you were very clear on this, that in reality, it's part and parcel of what we do day in, day out to be able to function effectively. And what's occurred over the last few years is that data has risen up the order of essential resource to be able to operate in this fashion. And we're still treating it really as something that we need to find ways to change and sharpen up. So it sounds glib. We know we've made progress when we're not talking about the problems of access to data, but we may be talking about the challenges of decision making based on what the data is telling us. It's really, Tom alluded to where we are internationally. We're not unique in facing up to these challenges of how such a valuable resource is being used. And the other factors, the private sector, because of other reasons, are quite good at being able to draw the public into using the data for good positive effect. But there is one thing that is significant. We've got to talk up the use cases and the benefits that this is put to, rather than overemphasizing, hey, we're joining this bit of data with this bit of data, what do you think about that?
I couldn't agree more, Alice. The public gets very lost when it talks about controllers and very technical terminology like that. And if we could focus more on the outcomes, the benefits, the kinds of examples, very human examples that you mentioned, Chris, that feels like a good starting point for that conversation. That brings me on just to another big topic that people are interested in, which is skills. What is your perspective on the skill base? Do we have the right skills to achieve the goals that you've described in government? Very curious for thoughts on that.
Go on, Chris.
That's right, go for it.
Okay, so you get the periodic push on this, because whenever we look at it, whichever year it is, you realise we should be further ahead than where we are. And Michael Gove gave his speech a while ago, digitally, to kind of highlight the real step change in data skills. My framing of this is often if I think that your average generalist in kind of policy understands the difference between structured data and unstructured, then we've made a huge progress. Because I think about the millions of spreadsheets that Chris's team produce on a regular basis. I've no doubt 70% of them will be structured in such a way you cannot use them any further in a kind of good, meaningful, analysis beyond. So there's a little bit about mainstreaming that digital skill amongst people more generally. We're running a program at the moment called the Data Masterclass for permanent secretaries in government. We've got 20 perm secs already signed up and taking part in it, and it's really interesting to see the feedback, and I'm undertaking it as well. To provide the kind of insight that the examples give you, and one example is the Challenger disaster some years ago, where simple data around the outside temperature impacting on the likelihood of danger, if you like, was missed and overlooked. And when you look at that kind of use of data at strategic decision-making levels, you realise that we're missing so many opportunities, I think, to be able to put data at that leadership level. So there's the kind of mainstreaming the use of data, and we don't need to get technical over that. Mainstreaming data in such a way that it can be used for decision making is absolutely vital. But secondly, then, the further progression of digital data and technology skills in the public sector. We know we can't pay as much as the private sector. We're always going to struggle in that regard. But as Tom said, it's addictive in the public sector using data because the stuff is so significant. And so we still need to grow our data scientists, our analysts, our developers, etc., in a way that there's a route for them to reach perm sec level as well. And I think of the years that I've been in government, I now have seen permanent secretaries around the table who, instead of speaking Latin now and again in their sort of discourse, will be throwing some data science concepts and clearly show a level of skill. So we're not there yet, but there's a lot in play to train to try and get us there.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. It's got an image of people speaking Latin in meetings. It doesn't happen that often in B&D, I have to say. But anyway, yeah. So I've got three super quick things. So I think the skills do exist. We just need to make sure we're employing them. And the issue there, I think, is that a number of the jobs that matter, sort of data scientists, behavioural scientists, they all sound like non-jobs, which we were all told, 10 years ago we had to get rid of. Well, I sort of feel like we've got to have the confidence to sort of tell the Taxpayers Alliance to go and do one, basically. I've saved billions more pounds than they ever will because I've employed data scientists and behavioural insight people and all the rest of it. So I think that's the first thing. I think that the second thing is this point about sort of being able to pay the private sector. I think the public sector have got to fall back in love with working with specialists in the private sector on a sort of a needs basis, right? So those big suppliers, as well as kind of smaller consultancies who can pay what they need, and we need to be very smart at using them carefully. And I think a number of those organisations need to up their game, frankly, in terms of their engagement with us. The thing that I'm most anxious about, and it is to the point about the perm secretaries. I mean, I often look around my management team and think to myself, like, what I'm trying to create here is Spotify, but I'm really anxious that in effect we're just like the board of HMV in 2003, where we've got a set of gold discs behind us, because that's like how we know about the music industry, and we're all a bit sort of faded, and remember the glory days of Zeppelin in '77 or something, but actually, and we sort of delegate down here to a set of people to kind of do the internet. It's like, no, guys, we need to completely reimagine what we're doing, because otherwise we're going to get taken out by something else. And so my bigger worry is like the skills aspiration of people at my level and the people around me at the top table. So I don't think we can wait for them to grow. We've got to kind of leapfrog it.
Thank you, Chris. I think sadly we have run out of time, but that's been a really gripping conversation, and I had lots more questions I was very keen to ask you, but they may have to wait for another occasion. So thank you very much, Alison, Chris, and thank you to the audience for bearing with us. And I will now hand back over to Henry.